Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in an Infinite Number of Years. We've been, for this Lent season, going through the Passion narrative of Mark. I have self-published a book called Explanatory Notes on Mark's Passion Week. Cue picture. Now, we are in the arrest now, which would be actually Thursday of this coming week, if you're watching this in relatively recent time of me filming it. But we are in Mark chapter 14, verse 43, and I stopped here last week. And so let's pick up where we left off. You'll notice here's a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane. This is actually from the garden when I went there with Wilbur Williams once upon a time, probably about 15 years ago now. It's been a while. But probably the same garden. I don't know, maybe same trees, very old trees. But this is where Jesus and his disciples kind of secretly went at night. Judas knew it, and he was willing to tell the chief priests where he was to give Jesus away. We talked a little bit about possible motivations he might have had last week. Let's go ahead and start with verse 43, shall we? The arrest. And immediately, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, interesting that Mark doesn't assume that the audience necessarily knows who Judas is. I haven't pondered that one too much. He indicates that Judas is one of the 12. That might indicate that the audience of Mark might have been relatively, new Christians, or in certainly not steeped in the knowledge of Christian traditions, it would seem, which is interesting. I don't have time to think about that. I don't know what conclusions I would come to, but it is interesting that he clarifies who Judas is. It may very well be that Mark is meant to preserve, the tradition is that Mark preserves the preaching of Peter. Perhaps Mark wants to, whoever the author is, we don't really know for sure who the author is, but maybe Mark wants to cast as wide a net as possible in his potential audience. But anyway, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrives, and with him a crowd from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders with swords and clubs. Verse 44, and the one who betrayed him had given them a sign, saying, whoever I should kiss, it's him. Take hold of him and lead him securely. So it seems like Judas is not sure what's going to happen when they get there. First of all, a number of interesting things here, right? The people who work for the high priest don't necessarily know who Jesus is. They wouldn't necessarily recognize him. They've heard about him, which is interesting because we assume obviously everybody knows who Jesus was in Jerusalem, but it may not have exactly been the case. Second thing is that they're ready for a fight. Judas doesn't know what the other disciples will do. Again, it's quite possible that the other disciples felt like there was going to be a battle of some sort. Now, they couldn't have thought that they could win a battle. They had to have thought that God was going to give them cover, artillery cover from heaven, so to speak. But they're not sure exactly how this is going to go down. And so they've come prepared. They've got swords, which is probably long daggers, not swords really, clubs. They're ready for a fight, and they don't know who Jesus is. So here they come. Verse 45, and having come immediately, having approached Jesus, Judas says, Rabbi, and he kissed him. Verse 46, and they laid hands on him and took hold of him. Verse 47, and one of those who stood by, having a long knife, struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now, it's always been curious to me that Mark, which of course is thought to be the earliest of the Gospels, doesn't say who these people are. So the Gospel of John says that it's that it's Peter who cuts off the high priest's servant ear, and that the name of the servant is Malchus. Now, Malchus, who knows where that would come from? So Malchus has a certain, maybe his name is Malchus. The omission of Peter as the one who strikes his ear is very curious. And I'm not sure exactly what it means. is Peter trying to cover up his tracks here? He says, "Now somebody cut off the ear. That's me. Don't put that in. Don't put that was me. Somebody." Anyway, it's a very curious omission, but I'll leave it at that. But it shows that they were ready for a fight, right? Somebody's ready to fight these people who are coming. And what does Jesus say? Verse 49, answering, Jesus said to them, "If you come upon me as like a thief, I mean, you've got swords or long daggers and clubs to arrest me. I was with you daily in the temple. You didn't lay hold on me." But, okay, this is fulfilling scriptures. And verse 50, and having left him, they all fled. So this is, his prediction. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And it happened here. Again, why aren't they doing it publicly? Well, probably because they're afraid of the people. The people have this sense that maybe now's the time. Some of the people, now maybe the time that God is going to restore Israel. Maybe there's going to be a fight. Maybe the disciples were thinking that too. We won't be fighting alone. There will be people throughout Jerusalem who, once it starts, it will catch fire and everybody else will join, and the Romans will be kicked out of Dodge, and the high priest will be overthrown. If they arrest Jesus secretly, then there's no opportunity for that kind of crowd to kind of come out of nowhere. Maybe there were a lot of people who were ready to do that in Jerusalem, but they're all asleep about now. And so they all fled, as Jesus predicted, of course. Verse 51, and a certain young man followed him, having worn a linen cloth on his naked body, and they grab him. Verse 52, and leaving behind the linen cloth, he fled naked. Now, I don't know whether this is naked, or mostly naked. In other words, maybe he had some sort of undergarment on, that he was sleeping in, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he slept au natural. But this is a curious little couple of verses, isn't it? Normally when we watch a movie and there's a scene like this, we think to ourselves, there's something going on here. This how does this fit in the plot? Now, I'm not saying that their sense of telling stories was exactly the same as ours. But of course, you may know the tradition. And the tradition is that this person could have been John Mark himself, or whoever the author of the Gospel of Mark is. Kind of showing that I was there too. Yep, I was the naked person in this story. And you could see how this would happen, right? Now, John Mark, we know from the book of Acts, chapter 12, that his mother, Mary, had a home in Jerusalem. I suspect that this is where it's where they have the prayer meeting for Peter in Acts chapter 12. I wonder if this is, 1, where the Last Supper was, 2, where the day of Pentecost happened, and of course 3, where the prayer meeting was. A fairly large house, I assume, which suggests that Mark comes from a family of some wealth, and then so this would be a known place. So let's say that the rumor gets back. Jesus is arrested. Everybody scatters. Well, some of them go to this house, right? Maybe not all of them, but at least some of those who scatter go to this house. And Mark is sleeping, and they're like, they've arrested Jesus. And he's like, what? How can this be? And he runs out. But he doesn't, have time to put a lot of clothes on. He puts his linen, cloth on his body. And he gets there, and they're like, who are you? Hey, wait there. And they grab him, and he runs away naked. That's a very plausible kind of storyline. So anyway, this may be John Mark here that it's talking about. I heard about somebody a long time ago who suggested maybe Mark is the beloved disciple. I mean, his name is John. The problem is that the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John are just so different that it's very difficult for me to believe that the source of the Gospel of John and the author of the Gospel of Mark, it's very hard for me to believe that they're the same individual. And so it's hard for me to believe that it's a great theory. John Mark would potentially fit the bill for the beloved disciple in many respects. Of course, some think it's Lazarus. But so anyway, I've not, it's very tempting, but every time I think about it, I end up saying, No, probably not. Verse 53. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and scribes gathered together. Now, in the Gospel of John, it's a more private meeting initially with Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas is the high priest. That is very plausible because it's late. Getting the whole Sanhedrin together in the middle of the night would be difficult. Maybe in the morning they could, get them all together. But anyway, there are tensions between the different accounts of the Gospels. But Mark presents there as being more a committee of the whole Sanhedrin getting together to consider it. Verse 54, and Peter from afar followed Jesus until he was inside the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the servants and warming himself to the light. So Peter has gotten farther than John Mark has, or whoever. Peter has actually made it into the courtyard, and he's warming himself and trying to see what happens here. He's very curious for obvious reasons. Verse 55, and the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin were seeking witness against Jesus in order to put him to death, and they were not finding any. Verse 56, for many were giving false witness against him, but their testimonies weren't the same. Round up the usual witnesses, but the witnesses are not because they're making things up. And of course, if you got to get your story straight. If you're going to make stuff up, get together first. And so they're saying that Jesus is saying bad stuff, but they're not agreeing. I heard he said, he turned me into a witch. No, what is it? He turned me into a newt. I got better. The witness is false. Verse 57. And some, having risen, were witnessing falsely against him, saying, verse 58, we ourselves heard him saying, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another one not made with hands. Verse 59. And not even thus was their witness the same. Now, the Gospel of Mark doesn't actually record Jesus saying this. The Gospel of John does. In John chapter 2, Jesus does say that. Of course, he's not talking about the temple. He's talking about his body. And so this is, I think there is clear tradition that Jesus said something like this, that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it. But of course, not literally, but in terms of his body is what Christians understand that statement to be. And of course, it's a resurrection, right? The temple is destroyed on Friday, but it is rebuilt on Sunday. As we will see in a second, unless I need to make this into two videos, the temple curtain rips in two as Jesus dies. That's a kind of destruction of the temple. From the standpoint of Hebrews, it is the destruction of the need for the sacrificial system. Now, it may have taken decades for that theology to fully develop in their understanding. They may not have initially understood all those things. But it will, as they process it and as the Holy Spirit helps them, these things will become clearer and clearer. So we go to the next verse, which is 60. And having arisen into the middle of the group, the high priest was asking Jesus, why aren't you answering anything in relation to these who are testifying against you? And I think I need a who there. Let me go ahead and put it in. And he was silent and did not answer anything. And again, the high priest was asking, and he says to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And this is the question, finally, that Jesus is willing to answer. Verse 62. And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man, you will see the Son of Humanity, sitting on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This is an allusion to Daniel 7:13, in which the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man, comes on the clouds to the Ancient of Days and is given authority over all nations and peoples and languages. Son of Man, Son of Humanity, we've talked about it before in this series. It is an expression that tends to have three categories of meanings in the Gospel of Mark. One is it's a way of self-reference. Jesus says, Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I don't have anywhere to lay my head. It's self-referential. And in that sense, it has that Jewish sense of son of is in the category of. So a son of man is somebody in the category of man. The Son of Humanity is somebody in the category of humanity. Jesus is a guy. And so a lot of times Jesus talks about himself that way. The Son of Man does this, the Son of Man does that. The second category is the suffering Son of Man, where Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. So there's the suffering Son of Man. And then the third is the one that's here. And that's an allusion to Daniel 7:13 and the Son of Humanity coming on the clouds. This use of it will become particularly prominent in a book called First Enoch. In the middle section, the parables of Enoch. The book of First Enoch is a composite work written over probably 3 centuries of time, various parts. So it's actually a collection. It's like the Pentateuch. It's a collection of books. The parables of Enoch have a passage very much like Matthew 25, white throne judgment, the Son of Man sitting in judgment over the nations, and so forth. There are probably 3 options here, right? One is that First Enoch is copying the Gospels. That seems unlikely. One is that the Gospels are copying First Enoch. That is often said. However, they're so close in time that it's quite possible that both of them are drawing on common tradition. Not really old tradition, I don't think. Probably within 50 to 100 years of the writing of the Gospel of Mark, this tradition has been percolating in Jewish apocalyptic thinking. But anyway, Jesus basically says, you're going to see me come on the clouds. Now, some have said, I think, like Bart Ehrman, I think, has said, he's not, and maybe Rudolf Bultmann, he's not talking about himself here. He's talking about an angelic figure that's going to come and bash the Romans. That doesn't seem to be the way that Mark understands it. Mark, because the high priest interprets Jesus to be talking about himself, and I think Mark interprets Jesus to be talking about himself. So, I mean, someone like Bultmann back in the mid-20th century would say, well, Jesus believed the Son of Man was coming, and then after Jesus rose from the dead, the early church identified him with the Son of Man. The problem there is, how do you explain the phrase Son of Man being on the lips of Jesus so consistently in the Gospels? It's not on anybody, nobody else in the Gospels calls Jesus Son of Man. It's exclusively something Jesus uses to refer to himself, which suggests to me that it goes back to the historical Jesus, to the Jesus of history. And so it doesn't fit the narrative that he talked about him as someone else, and then after the resurrection, then it got applied to him. So it's a puzzle. There's lots of books written on Son of Man. I believe Richard Balcom just came out with the first volume of a multi-volume series on the Son of Man. I haven't bought it yet, but it is something of interest to me to buy. Well, this is what the priest has been looking for. He's been looking for some way to consider Jesus guilty. And so verse 63, the high priest, having torn his shirt, says, "Why do we still have need of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What does it look like to you?" And they all condemned him to be guilty of death for claiming to be the Messiah of God. And of course, they believe that they can sell this to the Romans because he's a messianic pretender, a revolutionary, an insurrectionist. Finally, they've got what they wanted. They couldn't get it to him in debate. But at this point, Jesus, it's time. It wasn't time before. Now it's time. And so they condemned him to be guilty of death. For 65, some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, hit him, say to him, "Prophesy! Who hit you?" And the guards beat him. They're obviously mocking him. And so now we head into that handoff to Pilate. But first, the denial of Peter. Verse 66. And while Peter was down in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest comes, verse 67. Having seen Peter warming himself, having seen him, she says, "You also are with the Nazarene Jesus." Verse 68. But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are saying." And he went outside into the gateway, and a rooster sounded. Now, not all manuscripts have "and a rooster sounded." Probably the original didn't. But if you remember, Jesus says, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times." Now, by the way, roosters crow all the time. I have roosters. I have way too many roosters. And, the old idea that they crow at dawn, well, they do crow at dawn, but they crow all the time, all day, and sometimes in the middle of the night. But anyway, probably this and a rooster sounded was added to the manuscript tradition in order to, where was the first rooster crow? Because usually things don't get more complicated. Things get less complicated as copyists clean up things and answer the questions in the way they copy things. So it makes more sense that there was no record of a first rooster crowing, and yet the text said that before it crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And so it's more likely that some copyist said, well, we got to have a crow here somewhere, and added it in. By the way, Mark's gospel is the only one that says that the rooster will crow twice before Peter denies him 3 times. But again, Peter's very conspicuous. He has a Galilean accent, as we'll see here. Let's read on and see that. Verse 69, the servant girl, having seen him, began again to say to the ones who were standing around, hey, this guy's from them. Verse 70, and again he was denying it. And after a little while, again, those who were standing were saying to Peter, you are truly with them. You're a Galilean. I think one of the other accents, one of the other Gospels talks about his accent, giving him away. And there's a reminder that, if you live in England, there's a Newcastle accent, there's a London accent, there's a Cockney, and then there's the other accents, Scottish English, Welsh English, Irish English, lots of different accents. And the same was true in Israel, right? You've got a Galilean accent that Peter and probably Jesus had. And so verse 71, and he began to invoke curses on himself and swear, I don't know what you're saying. And then, of course, as we see, the rooster crows. Verse 72, and immediately a second time the rooster sounded, and Peter remembered the word as Jesus said to him, before the rooster sounds twice, 3 times you will deny me. And he broke down and cried, as you would expect. By the way, here's a picture, if you're watching the video version of this, of Galicantu, rooster crow, which is thought to be the jail of the high priest that you can still go see even today in Jerusalem. That's from my time there. Okay, chapter 15. I think I have about 10 more minutes before I'll have to split this. So let me go ahead and split it here. Wisdom is the better part of valor, right? So we have finished chapter 14. We'll make this a 2-part. What is this called? Through the Bible. We'll make it a 2-part through the Bible. And we'll stop there with verse 14. And then the second part will be the trial and crucifixion of Matthew 15 in Through the Bible in 10 plus years.